My neighbor uses cones to save parking spots. Broke his foot on it. The sound of a metatarsal bone snapping is not a loud noise in the grand scheme of the universe, but on a quiet, frost-bitten Tuesday morning in the suburbs, it sounded like a dry branch stepping on a landmine. I was sitting in my bay window, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that was burning my palms, watching the inevitable collision of physics and ego unfold across the street. Gary, my neighbor, was lying on the asphalt. He wasn't screaming yet. He was in that silent, breathless vacuum that exists in the split second after the brain registers pain but before the vocal cords get the memo. He was clutching his foot, rolling back and forth in the dirty slush of the gutter, his face a mask of purple, contorted rage. And standing next to him, immovable, silent, and triumphant, was the orange traffic cone. It hadn't moved an inch. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was the best cup I have ever tasted. To understand why I spent my own money to turn a piece of plastic into a weapon of mass destruction, you have to understand the geography of our street. We live in a neighborhood that was built in the 1950s, back when families had one car and it fit in the driveway. Now, everyone has 3 cars, a boat, and a work van. Street parking isn't a luxury here, it is a blood sport. But the street is public property. It belongs to the city. It belongs to the taxpayers. First come, first served. That is the law of the jungle. Unless you are Gary. Gary lives in the house directly opposite mine. Gary drives a Ford F-250 Super Duty that is lifted so high he needs a ladder to get into it. It has never seen dirt. It has never hauled a load of lumber. It is a pavement princess, a pristine, white monument to his insecurities. And Gary believes that the 20 feet of public asphalt in front of his house is his personal, deeded fiefdom. Every morning at 6 a.m., Gary leaves for work. And every morning, like a religious ritual, he pulls 2 orange construction cones out of his truck bed and places them in the street to block his spot. It started 6 months ago. At first, people respected it. We're polite. We're neighbors. But then parking got tighter. The snow started piling up, narrowing the road. 3 days ago, I came home from a double shift. My back was spasming. My eyes were burning. There were no spots. Not one. I circled the block 3 times. The only open space was in front of Gary's house, guarded by those 2 bright orange sentinels. I stopped my car. I looked at the cones. I looked at my house across the street. Not today, I whispered. I got out. I walked over to the cones. I picked them up, they were light, flimsy plastic, and I tossed them onto Gary's lawn. I parked my car. I went inside and passed out. The next morning, yesterday morning, I walked out to go to work. Gary was waiting for me. He was standing on his porch, arms crossed, wearing a tactical vest over a hoodie because of course he was. Hey, he barked. You touch my property? I ignored him and walked to my car. That's when I saw it. A deep, jagged trench had been carved into the passenger side door of my sedan. It wasn't an accidental scratch. It was malicious. It curled and looped, cutting down to the primer. I felt the heat rising in my neck, a prickly, suffocating sensation that started at my collarbone and crawled up behind my ears. My hands balled into fists. I pulled out my phone. I have a dashcam that records on motion. I didn't say a word to Gary. I just got in the car and pulled the SD card. I watched the footage at work. It was 11 p.m. A figure walked up to my car. The streetlights were dim, but the figure was holding a massive set of keys. He looked around. Then, he dragged a key across my door with the casual cruelty of a vandal who thinks he owns the world. It was Gary. I called the non-emergency line. An officer came out to my work to take a report. It's vandalism, Officer Miller said, looking at the footage on my laptop. But the face is obscured by the hoodie. I can't positively identify him. It's grainy. Unless he confesses, it's a civil matter. You'll have to sue him. A civil matter? I asked, my voice tight. He caused $2,000 in damage because I parked on a public street. I know, Miller shrugged. It sucks. But without a clear face, the DA won't touch it. Maybe get better cameras. I drove home that night with a pit in my stomach. The law wasn't going to help me. Gary had won. He had marked his territory with a key on my paint. When I turned onto my street, the cones were back. They were sitting there in the street, mocking me. Gary's truck was gone, he was out somewhere, but his plastic soldiers were holding the line. I parked 3 blocks away. I walked home in the freezing rain. I sat in my kitchen, listening to the radiator hiss. I thought about slashing his tires. I thought about throwing a brick through his window. But those were crimes. Those would get me arrested. I needed something else. I needed him to hurt himself. I needed his own arrogance to be the weapon. I looked out the window at the cones. They were standard traffic cones. Hollow. Open at the bottom. Lightweight. I remembered a project I did with my dad when I was a kid. We made boat anchors out of buckets and concrete. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I looked at the clock. 7 p.m. Home Depot was open until 9 o'clock. I grabbed my keys. I bought 4 bags of Quikrete high-strength concrete mix. I bought a mixing tub. I bought a trowel. I bought a gallon of water. I drove home. I pulled into my garage and closed the door. I waited. I waited until the street was dead silent. I waited until Gary's lights went out at midnight. At 3 a.m., I dressed in all black. I pulled my hood up. I slipped out the side door. The street was empty. The wind was howling, which was perfect cover. I walked across the street to the cones. I picked them up. They weighed maybe 2 pounds each. I carried them into my garage. I worked fast. I poured the gray powder into the tub. I added the water. I mixed it until it was the consistency of thick oatmeal. It smelled like wet earth and chemicals. I flipped the cones upside down. I shoveled the heavy, gray sludge into the hollow interiors. I packed it down. I made sure it filled every nook and cranny, all the way to the tip. Concrete weighs about 150 pounds per cubic foot. A standard 28-inch traffic cone has a volume that, when filled solid, weighs roughly 60 to 70 pounds. But the weight wasn't the point. The density was the point. I let them set. Quikrete sets fast, but I needed them rock hard. I used a space heater to speed up the curing process. By 5 a.m., they were solid. They weren't plastic markers anymore. They were pyramidal boulders disguised in orange vinyl. I lifted the first one. I groaned. It was heavy. It was a dead weight. I carried them back out to the street one by one, hugging them to my chest. I placed them exactly where Gary had left them. To the naked eye, they looked identical. Maybe a little cleaner, a little sturdier, but identical. I went back inside. I washed the concrete dust off my hands. I made a pot of coffee. And I waited. At 7:45 a.m., the front door of the house across the street flew open. Gary stepped out. He was wearing his usual work uniform, polo shirt, khakis, and those slip-on Merrell hiking shoes that middle-aged men wear when they want to look ready for adventure but are actually just going to an office. He was holding a travel mug and his keys. He looked stressed. He was running late. I leaned forward in my chair. He marched down his driveway. He clicked the unlock button on his truck, which was parked in the driveway, but he had to move the cones to get out because he parks diagonally to block the sidewalk too, another violation. But who's counting? Usually, Gary kicks the cones. He doesn't pick them up. He walks up to them and gives them a lazy, dismissive punt with the side of his foot to slide them onto the grass. It's a gesture of pure arrogance. Get out of my way, inanimate object. He approached the first cone. The left one. He didn't break stride. He swung his right leg back. He wound up. He put his hips into it. Here we go, I whispered. His foot connected with the cone. Crunch. The cone didn't slide. It didn't tip. It didn't move a millimeter. It was 70 pounds of cured concrete bonded to the asphalt by friction and gravity. Gary's foot stopped instantly. The rest of Gary kept moving. His ankle rolled violently. I saw his leg compress. Then came the scream. Gah! He dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the driveway. He hopped on one foot for a second, trying to process the impossibility of the situation, before gravity won and he collapsed into the slush. He grabbed his foot. He was howling. He was cursing words that would make a sailor blush. Who glued it? Who glued the cone? I sipped my coffee. Glued. That's cute. He sat there for a full minute, rocking back and forth. He touched the cone. He tried to shove it with his hand. It didn't budge. He realized then that it wasn't glued. It was heavy. He looked around wildly. He looked at my house. I stayed back from the window, in the shadows. He struggled to his feet. He was limping bad. He couldn't put weight on his right foot. He had to lean on the hood of his truck to stay upright. He looked at his watch. He was really late now. Most people, at this point, would give up. They would call an ambulance. They would call in sick. But Gary is not most people. Gary is a man who drives an F-250 to commute to a desk job. Gary believes in horsepower over logic. He hobbled around to the driver's side of his truck. He hauled himself up into the cab. I heard the engine roar to life. The 6.7L power-stroke diesel rattled the windows. He threw it into reverse. He backed out of the driveway, swinging wide to avoid the cones. He ended up in the street, perpendicular to the curb. He needed to park the truck in the spot he had saved so he could run back inside and, I don't know, maybe ice his foot. Or maybe he was just trying to push the cones out of the way with the truck because he couldn't lift them. He lined the truck up with the cones. He's not, I said aloud. He's not that stupid. He was. He inched the truck forward. The massive chrome bumper approached the orange tip of the concrete cone. He clearly thought he could just nudge it. Push it onto the grass. He thought his truck was invincible. He tapped the gas. The bumper made contact. The cone, being a pyramid with a low center of gravity and extreme weight, didn't slide. It wedged. As the bumper pushed against it, the cone acted like a ramp. The front of the truck rose up. Screech. The sound of plastic and metal grinding against concrete filled the air. Gary hit the gas harder, thinking he was just caught on a snag. Crunch. The cone slipped under the front air dam. It hooked onto something underneath. The truck lurched forward and then slammed down. But the cone was now under the truck. Gary realized his mistake. He threw it into reverse. This was the fatal error. The cone was wedged behind the front bumper valance and in front of the front axle. When he reversed, the cone caught the inside of the bumper. Ripe. The entire front bumper assembly, the chrome, the plastic, the fog lights, the license plate, tore away from the frame with a sound like a gunshot. It dragged across the asphalt, hanging by a few wires. Fluid started leaking. Green fluid. Radiator fluid. The cone had smashed the bottom of the radiator. Gary stopped. The truck idled roughly, then sputtered and died. Silence returned to the street, broken only by the hiss of coolant hitting the hot engine block. I set my coffee down. I stood up. I put on my coat. I walked out my front door. Gary was sitting in the cab, staring through the windshield at the steam rising from his hood. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world dissolve. He opened the door and fell out. He forgot about his broken foot. He landed on it and screamed again. "My truck," he wailed. "My truck." I walked to the edge of my driveway. "Morning, Gary," I called out. "Rough start." He spun his head toward me. His eyes were bloodshot. "You," he shrieked. "You did this. You sabotaged the cones." "Sabotaged?" I asked, walking closer, inspecting the wreckage. "Gary, those are street cones. They don't belong to anyone. Why did you drive over them?" "They're concrete," he yelled, pointing at the one that had destroyed his radiator. It was sitting there, covered in green slime, looking totally unbothered. "You filled them with concrete." "Why would I do that?" I asked innocently. "I don't own cones." "You're the cone guy. Maybe you bought the heavy-duty ones by mistake." "I'm calling the police," he screamed. "I'm suing you. You destroyed my truck. You broke my foot." "Go ahead," I said. "Call them." He did. Officer Miller showed up 20 minutes later. The same officer who had taken my report yesterday. He got out of his cruiser. He looked at the truck. He looked at the bumper lying 10 feet away. He looked at the green puddle. He looked at Gary, who was sitting on the curb holding his foot. Then he looked at the cone. He walked over to it. He tried to kick it. It didn't move. He bent down and tried to lift it. He grunted. "Heavy," Miller said. "He filled them with cement." Gary shouted. "Arrest him." Miller looked at me. "Did you fill these with cement?" "Officer," I said. "I have no idea what you're talking about." I woke up to a loud crash. I came outside and saw my neighbor had driven his truck into some construction debris. "They aren't construction debris," Gary yelled. "They're my cones. I put them there to save my spot." Miller turned to Gary slowly. "Sir," Miller said. "Are you admitting that you placed illegal obstructions in a public roadway?" Gary froze. What? "It is illegal to place objects in the street to reserve parking," Miller recited. "It's a code violation. And if you placed them there, and then you drove into them, that's a single vehicle accident involving a stationary object." "But he modified them." Gary pointed at me. "He turned them into rocks." "Can you prove he touched them?" Miller asked. "Do you have video?" Gary looked at his house. He didn't have cameras. He was too cheap. "No," Gary whispered. "Then here is what I see," Miller said, pulling out his ticket book. "I see a resident who placed illegal traffic control devices in the roadway, and then negligently operated his vehicle, colliding with said devices. I see a destroyed truck and a lot of coolant that the fire department is going to have to clean up. That's an environmental hazard bill. You're ticketing me." Gary screeched. "Reckless driving," Miller said, writing. "Failure to maintain control. And illegal dumping for the cones. And you'll need a tow truck. And an ambulance, by the looks of that foot." I watched as the tow truck dragged the beast onto the flatbed. The scraping sound was music. Gary went to the hospital. The truck was totaled. The frame was bent from the impact. The engine block was cracked. Insurance denied the claim because he admitted to the police that he hit his own objects that he placed in the road. It fell under intentional acts or gross negligence, I'm not sure, but the adjuster told the neighborhood gossip that Gary was on the hook for the remaining $40,000 on the loan. Gary moved out 2 months later. He couldn't afford the truck payments and the mortgage with the lawsuit from the city for the road damage. I still have one of the cones. I keep it in my garage. It makes a great doorstop. Every time I look at it, I remember the sound of the crunch. Some people say I went too far. Some people say concrete is dangerous. But I say, if you're going to claim public land as your own, you better be ready to defend it. And if you're going to kick the world, you better make sure the world isn't made of stone. So, tell me. Am I the monster for turning traffic cones into tank traps, or did Gary just fail his driving test in the most expensive way possible?
If you have made it this far and want to see more videos like this, then kindly subscribe and turn on notifications so you may never miss another story like this.